Egypt is one of the regions in the world where we encounter the first signs of civilization. The contributions of the ancient Egyptian period to science are numerous. We see a similar contribution in a cultural sense, because the ancient people living here have contributed countless stories to the world cultural heritage, dating back to the present day. The first board games in history were played by Egyptians. We are talking about a time before games like backgammon and chess. Egyptians were playing board games similar to today's games such as Monopoly in the 3500s BC. In addition to games such as Mehen, Dogs and Jackals, a game called Senet, in which Queen Nefertiti played, was the most popular. As far as we understand from the ruins that have survived until today, a series of stones were moved in this game played with dice and sticks on a painted 30-square board. Other than the materials, this game is pretty much the same as today's board games. During ancient Egypt, women's rights were much more advanced than we thought. It is possible to see these rights by making a small comparison. For example, in the ancient Greek world, women were considered the property of their men and did not have any rights. In ancient Egypt, there was a marriage contract and the woman had the right to divorce. At that time, women generally worked from home, but those who did the same work as men were paid the same wage. Moreover, women could buy and sell property, leave wills, serve on juries, and sign legal contracts. Even European women had difficulty obtaining these rights a few centuries ago. Pharaohs were not skinny like the statues. When we look at later or contemporary works depicting the ancient Egyptian period, we see that the pharaohs and queens were either very skinny or quite athletic. But think about it, couldn't these people who ruled over Egypt eat, drink and enjoy themselves? Of course it was. These rulers, who fed on beer, wine, bread and honey, were not only thin but also almost obese, and most of them were diabetic. When the mummy of Queen Hatshepsut, who lived in the 15th century BC, was examined, it was seen that she was very fat, had diabetes, and was almost completely hairless due to her poor health. When Egypt is mentioned, undoubtedly one of the first figures that comes to our mind is the legendary Queen Seven. She is Cleopatra, but in a twist of fate, she is not an Egyptian, even though she was born in Alexandria. Cleopatra comes from the Greek Macedonian lineage of Ptolemy I, the great commander who was there when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt between 323 and 30 BC and remained true to its Greek roots. In fact, one of the first people from this dynasty to speak Egyptian was Cleopatra. The first known peace agreement in history was signed here. Since the 11th century BC, there has been a 200-year struggle between Egypt and the Hittite Empire to seize the lands of today's Syria. The Battle of Kadesh, which took place in 1274 BC, is one of the bloodiest battles of this struggle. II was finally fed up with this struggle in which no one side could win no matter what they did. Ramses III and Hattushi signed the Treaty of Kadesh, the world's first peace treaty, in 1259 BC. How ironic that the lands where blood carries the body today actually met peace thousands of years ago. If you think that those who built the pyramids were slaves, you are very wrong. No, aliens didn't do it either. It was construction workers who were masters of their craft, who built the Egyptian pyramids that we admire even today. Since these workers were competent people and were considered successful craftsmen, they received better wages than our minimum wages today. These teams even had names they used among themselves, such as the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. The story that slaves built the pyramids was created by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC. Yes, there were slaves in ancient Egypt, but their numbers were not as many as we thought. Laborers and servants were wage earners. There is even an interesting detail about this. In the 12th century BC, Pharaoh III. Workers working for Ramses went on strike when they did not receive the promised grain payments. No, none of them were fired, killed or whipped. The strike worked and they received the promised payments. The cause of Tutankhamun's death may be quite interesting. We know some details about the life of Tutankhamun, who went down in ancient Egyptian history as a child pharaoh, but his death is a bit suspicious. When you look at his mummy, it is seen that he does not have a rib cage. In some period depictions, Tutankhamun is seen trying to hunt a hippopotamus. Evaluating these two findings together, experts think that the child pharaoh may have been attacked by a wild animal during the hunt and died due to a hippo bite. It is possible that Tutankhamun died due to a hippopotamus bite, because the Egyptians are known to have lived in close proximity to animals, and they are even thought to be the first civilization to have pets. It is already a known fact that cats were considered sacred in ancient Egypt. In addition, Egyptians kept some wild creatures such as hawks, dogs, lions, and baboons as pets. Moreover, there is evidence that some monkeys were trained and used for different purposes. Have you ever thought why we call Egypt Egypt? The official Arabic name of Egypt is Kumhuriyet Misr el Arabi. In other words, Egyptians call their own country Egypt, and this is translated into our language in this way, with a slight change. The English name Egypt dates back to the period before Egypt became Muslim. During this period, the Greeks called this region Aegyptos. This name turned into Egypt over time. The reason why we call the plant maize is that it came to Istanbul via Egypt in the 17th century and was known by names such as Egyptian wheat and Egyptian millet. Over time, it was shortened and called corn. During mummification, the brain was removed by pulling it through the nose of the corpse, not by opening the skull. Ancient Egyptians were slowly removing brain tissues through their nostrils with specially designed hooks. This was a very delicate job because it was necessary not to distort the mummy's face. An archaeologist named Phil Sleek also has a theory that the Egyptians used hooks to dismember the brain and allow it to flow through the nose. In ancient Egypt, people mourned when their cats died by shaving their eyebrows. According to information in the records of the Greek historian Herodotus, this tradition of shaving eyebrows was quite common in Egypt. It is even said that people who kill cats are thrown into pits full of poisonous snakes. You may have heard that cats are mummified when they die. To prevent having sex with dead women, they were kept for a few days to decompose after their death. Such a practice was implemented after it was noticed that those who carried out the embalming were raping the corpses of beautiful and young women in particular. Dead men were immediately sent to be mummified. You may think it strange that ancient Egypt had birth control, but the content of the formula used for it is even weirder. Women would apply a mixture of ingredients such as honey, crocodile feces, and acacia tree flowers to their vaginas, thereby reducing the chances of getting pregnant. Apparently, this mixture had a spermicidal effect, but how they discovered this is still a matter of curiosity. In ancient Egypt, it was impossible to be unemployed if you were born with diseases that caused physical changes, such as dwarfism. Such people were generally employed in jobs such as gold mining, where safety was a priority. The reason was that even if they stole the gold and ran away, it was easy to detect them in the crowd. When the pharaohs were on their deathbeds, they gave death warrants to their servants and were buried with them. Even though no orders were given, the servants were committing suicide to show their loyalty in the afterlife. After a certain period, instead of killing the servants, enchanted figurines called ashabti began to be used and the tradition of massacre ended. After battles, enemy soldiers' hands were cut off and sometimes presented to the pharaohs. In the remains found, it was determined that the right hand was generally cut off and saved. In this way, ancient Egyptian soldiers showed their superiority and proved that they were honorable. Ancient Egypt was founded in the south and continued to expand northward. The reason for this was that the north was under Mediterranean waters. The cursed pharaoh Tutankhamun was born as a result of an incestuous relationship. As DNA tests conducted in recent years have proven, Tutankhamun's parents were also full siblings. In fact, this is not surprising at some point, because it was quite common for noble families to marry consanguineously in order to remain pure. It was also possible to take a type of pregnancy test in ancient Egypt. According to records, women were defecating on wheat seeds for a week, and if this seed germinated, they knew they were pregnant. It is claimed that they can understand the gender of the baby this way, but this is not realistic. Crocodiles were killed and mummified to be sacrificed to the gods. This tradition was born to worship the god named Sobek, who was associated with Nile crocodiles. People who showed their devotion and faith in this way thought that they would be comfortable in the afterlife.